A 9-year-old girl vanished while selling candy in her own neighborhood. What began as an innocent afternoon quickly became Spokane's worst nightmare. As hundreds of volunteers desperately searched for her, a military helicopter helping in the rescue slammed into high-tension power lines and crashed into the river, killing 3 men. 16 days later, her small body was found deep in the woods, bound with her own clothing, sexually assaulted, and brutally strangled. For 62 years, this case stood as the Mount Everest of cold cases, the most haunting unsolved mystery in Spokane history, until one breakthrough finally exposed the monster who had been hiding in plain sight. How does a little girl disappear while selling candy door to door? And why did it take over half a century to unmask her killer? Candy Rogers was just 9 years old in the spring of 1959. She was a bright, cheerful, and outgoing little girl whose smile could light up a room. Neighbors adored her. Classmates remembered her as the friendly girl who was always quick to laugh and eager to help others. As the only child of Carl and Elaine Rogers, Candy was the center of her parents' universe. After their divorce, she lived with her mother, Elaine, a dedicated school teacher who poured her heart into creating a warm and stable home for her daughter. The bond between them was incredibly close. By 4th grade, Candy had found a passion in the Bluebirds, the junior division of the Camp Fire Girls. She threw herself into the group's activities, camping, hiking, crafts, and especially the fundraising projects. That spring, the Bluebirds were selling boxes of mints to raise money for upcoming trips and programs. On Friday, the 6th of March, 1959, Candy came home from school excited for the weekend. After a quick oatmeal cookie and a few playful moments with the family dog, she picked up her 7 boxes of campfire mints. Before she walked out the door, Elaine reminded her, as she always did, "Be home before dark, sweetheart." Candy smiled, gave her mother a kiss, and promised she would. At around 4 p.m., she stepped outside into the quiet streets of her West Central Spokane neighborhood, clutching the colorful boxes of candy. To anyone who saw her that afternoon, she was just a happy little girl going door to door, doing her part for a group she loved. The neighborhood felt safe. The sun was still shining. No one could have imagined that this would be the last time Candy Rogers was ever seen alive. As the clock ticked past 5:30 p.m., Elaine began to feel the first pangs of worry. Candy was usually very responsible about returning home on time. The sun was slowly setting, and the neighborhood streets were growing quieter. Elaine stepped outside several times, hoping to catch sight of her daughter walking back with empty boxes, but the street remained empty. By 6 p.m., Elaine's concern had turned into genuine fear. She contacted Candy's grandfather, Stanley Newton, and informed him that her daughter had not returned. Word quickly spread to other relatives, friends, and neighbors. Within 30 minutes, a small group of worried residents had gathered to begin searching the immediate neighborhood. They went door to door, asking if anyone had seen Candy. Several people confirmed they had spotted her earlier that afternoon, carrying the distinctive boxes of campfire mints. However, no one could recall seeing her after 5 p.m. The searchers moved further along the streets, calling out her name into the growing darkness. Around 7 p.m., while searching near Pited Drive, Stanley Newton and his companions had a frightening close call when a speeding car nearly struck them. Shaken but undeterred, they continued their efforts. Then came a significant discovery. 6 boxes of campfire mints were found scattered across the road. Candy had left home with 7. The missing 7th box only deepened the growing sense of dread. As night fully descended, the search became more difficult. Flashlights cut through the darkness while voices echoed through the quiet streets. Still, there was no trace of Candy. Elaine remained at home, unable to sit still, alternating between staring out the window and praying silently. The uncertainty was unbearable. By 9 p.m., the Spokane Police Department had been officially notified. Officers joined the growing group of volunteers. The once peaceful neighborhood transformed into a scene of frantic activity. Yet despite hours of searching, Candy Rogers had seemingly vanished without a trace. No one could have imagined that this ordinary Friday afternoon would mark the beginning of one of the most agonizing ordeals Spokane had ever witnessed, a disappearance that would remain unsolved for more than 6 decades. The neighborhood search was just the beginning. What happened next shocked the entire city. Before we continue, hit that like button if you're already hooked on this story, and comment. Have you ever been involved in a community search for a missing person? The following morning, Saturday, the 7th of March, 1959, the disappearance of Candy Rogers had become front-page news across Spokane. What began as a small neighborhood search quickly escalated into one of the largest manhunts the city had ever seen. Hundreds of volunteers, including friends, neighbors, and complete strangers, poured into the streets determined to find the missing girl. Police officers, sheriff's deputies, and firefighters coordinated the effort. Search teams on horseback combed through wooded areas, while others patrolled major roads in vehicles. The United States Air Force even offered assistance, sending a helicopter to scan the terrain from above. The aircraft carried 4 trained personnel and 1 pilot, flying low over the dense forests and along the Spokane River. Tragically, the rescue operation itself claimed lives. While flying over the river, the pilot failed to notice a high-tension power line until it was too late. The helicopter struck the wire, spiraled out of control, and crashed into the water. 3 men lost their lives in the accident: Airman Merlis D. Ray, Sergeant William A. McDonnell, and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Faddick. The shocking deaths devastated the entire search community. Instead of discouraging volunteers, however, the tragedy only strengthened their resolve. Many felt the 3 men should not have died in vain. Despite the expanded efforts, the days that followed brought only frustration and heartbreak. Searchers covered miles of rugged terrain, forests, and riverbanks, but found no sign of Candy. Elaine Rogers barely ate or slept, becoming a shadow of her former self as she waited desperately for any news of her only child. Then, on March 22, 16 days after Candy vanished, a crucial breakthrough occurred. 2 airmen, Howard Lawrence and Richard Bergen, were hunting woodchucks in a heavily wooded area approximately 7 miles from Candy's home. In a small clearing, they discovered a pair of small blue suede shoes. Recognizing they likely belonged to a child, the men took the shoes back to base and reported their find. Police immediately contacted Candy's grandfather, Stanley Newton, who confirmed the shoes closely resembled those Candy had been wearing. This discovery shifted the entire search operation to the remote forested area. The very next day, Sunday, March 23, a large team of officers and volunteers returned to the site at dawn. After hours of careful searching through thick underbrush, one officer noticed a suspicious mound covered with pine needles and branches. As he brushed away the debris, he was horrified to see a small knee protruding from underneath. Further inspection revealed the badly decomposed body of a child. It was Candy Rogers. Her clothing was torn in several places, her feet were bound with strips of fabric torn from her own clothes, and another strip was wrapped tightly around her neck. The scene left even seasoned officers shaken. The discovery of Candy's body ended the desperate search, but began a new and even darker chapter, the hunt for her killer. The discovery of Candy Rogers' body sent shockwaves through Spokane. Her remains were carefully transported for an immediate autopsy. The results confirmed the worst fears of investigators and the community. Candy had been sexually assaulted before being strangled to death. The medical examiner noted that strips of her own clothing had been used to bind her feet and wrap tightly around her neck. The brutality of the crime left detectives convinced they were dealing with a deeply disturbed individual. Spokane Police Chief Clifford Payne addressed the media with grim determination. "We'll put every available man on the case and keep them there till the thing is solved," he declared. "We know what we're looking for now. We're looking for a maniac." The investigation moved quickly into high gear. Detectives began interviewing dozens of people who had been in the area that afternoon. They examined every possible lead, no matter how small. One early clue stood out: a strange purple smear found on Candy's clothing that smelled strongly of grape gum. This detail immediately directed attention toward Hugh Bion Morse, a convicted serial killer already serving time in prison. Morse was known for his distinctive habit of chewing grape gum and had a long history of violent crimes against women and girls. Morse was brought in for questioning. However, he firmly denied any involvement in Candy's murder. Despite intense interrogation, detectives could not find sufficient physical evidence linking him directly to the crime scene. Without concrete proof, he could not be charged. Nevertheless, he remained a prime suspect for many years. Hundreds of tips flooded into the police department from concerned citizens. Some claimed to have seen suspicious individuals near the forest, while others reported strange vehicles in the neighborhood that day. Every lead was painstakingly followed up, but each one eventually led to a dead end. As weeks turned into months, frustration grew among the investigators. The community tried to return to normalcy, but the fear lingered. Parents kept closer watch on their children, and the once peaceful streets of West Central Spokane felt permanently changed. Candy was laid to rest in a somber funeral, attended by hundreds of mourners. Her devastated mother, Elaine, struggled to cope with the unimaginable loss. Tragedy struck the Rogers family once again in June 1963, when Candy's father, Carl Rogers, took his own life in a hotel room in Walla Walla. He had never recovered from the grief of losing his only daughter. With no arrest in sight, the case gradually grew cold. What had begun as an intensive manhunt slowly faded into one of Spokane's most infamous unsolved mysteries, a painful wound that would remain open for more than 6 decades. For more than 4 decades, Candy Rogers' murder remained one of Spokane's most frustrating cold cases. Despite exhaustive early investigations, the trail had gone completely cold. Traditional detective work had reached its limit. However, by the early 2000s, a new frontier in forensic science began offering renewed hope: DNA technology. In 2001, detectives made a critical decision. They submitted Candy's preserved clothing, particularly her underwear, to the Washington State Crime Laboratory. Forensic analysts successfully extracted a usable DNA profile from the evidence. This was a major milestone. The profile was entered into the National DNA Database with high expectations. Unfortunately, no matches appeared. The same profile was later compared to Hugh Bion Morse, the longtime suspect, but it conclusively ruled him out. Once again, the case slipped back into silence. By 2017, a revolutionary technique called forensic genetic genealogy had emerged, helping solve several high-profile cold cases across the United States. This method combined traditional DNA analysis with genealogical research to identify suspects through distant family connections. Spokane Police Department decided it was time to try this new approach on Candy's case. Forensic scientist Brittany Wright from the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory was assigned to lead the renewed effort. Wright first retrieved the DNA sample that had been stored in a freezer since 2001. She carefully reanalyzed it to confirm it still matched the original profile. With cautious optimism, she conducted diagnostic testing to determine whether the sample was suitable for genetic genealogy. The results were concerning. The DNA was highly degraded due to the passage of time and improper storage conditions in the early years. Wright sent the sample to a private forensic laboratory specializing in genealogy. Weeks later, the devastating news arrived. The sample was too degraded to generate usable results. The laboratory returned the remaining extract, leaving detectives deeply disappointed. After more than 60 years, it seemed the final opportunity to solve Candy's murder might be slipping away. Undeterred, Wright refused to give up. She began searching for laboratories capable of working with extremely degraded or low-quantity DNA samples. Her persistence led her to Othram Labs, a cutting-edge forensic laboratory based in Texas. Othram had developed specialized technology and proprietary methods specifically designed to recover and analyze DNA from the most challenging evidence samples that other labs had declared hopeless. Wright reached out to Othram and explained the details of the Candy Rogers case. After reviewing the sample, the lab confirmed they could attempt the analysis. A small portion of the precious remaining DNA was carefully shipped to Texas. The wait began. 6 months later, in 2019, Othram Labs delivered a breakthrough that would finally crack the case. Using advanced genetic genealogy techniques, they built a detailed family tree from the unknown DNA profile. The results pointed strongly to 3 brothers from the Hoff family: John, Andrew, and Terry Hoff. All 3 men had already passed away, but this was the first solid lead in decades. Investigators immediately focused on John Ray Hoff. Background checks revealed compelling details. In 1959, John had lived just 1 mile from Candy's home in West Central Spokane. He grew up in the area and was familiar with the neighborhoods where Candy sold her mints. More disturbingly, in 1961, just 2 years after Candy's murder, John was arrested for assaulting a woman. Court records showed he had used force to remove her clothes, tied her up with the fabric, and attempted to strangle her. The similarities to Candy's case were chilling. To confirm the connection, detectives located John's daughter, Kathy. They approached her carefully, explaining they were investigating her late father in relation to a cold case. Kathy, who had already researched the Candy Rogers case online, provided a DNA sample. The results were overwhelming. Kathy's DNA was 2.9 million times more likely to be related to the crime scene profile than a random person from the general population. With this strong statistical link, investigators secured a search warrant and Kathy's permission to take the final step. They traveled to the cemetery where John Hoff was buried and exhumed his remains. A fresh DNA sample was extracted and sent for testing. The results left no room for doubt. John Ray Hoff's DNA matched the evidence from Candy's clothing with 100% certainty. After 62 years, the killer had finally been identified. What made this resolution possible was not just luck, but the relentless determination of multiple generations of detectives who refused to let the case die. From the careful preservation of decades-old evidence, through repeated failures with degraded DNA, to the pioneering work at Othram Labs, the breakthrough represented a triumph of modern forensic science and sheer investigative perseverance. The identification of John Hoff not only solved Spokane's oldest cold case, but also brought a painful chapter to a long-awaited close. The announcement that John Ray Hoff had been identified as Candy Rogers' killer did not arrive with the drama of a courtroom verdict or the finality of an arrest. It arrived quietly through a press release, a DNA report, and a name that most people in Spokane had never heard before. For the survivors who had waited 62 years, the news landed like something between relief and grief. Joanne Poss, Candy's 77-year-old cousin, had spent her entire adult life carrying the weight of that unanswered question. When detectives finally called with the news, she struggled to find the right words. "It's not closure," she said honestly. "But at least there's some form of satisfaction knowing that the person that did it is at least named. He may be in a grave, but he's named." What hurt most, she said, was thinking about those who never lived to hear it. Candy's mother, Elaine, had died without ever knowing who took her daughter. Her grandfather, Stanley Newton, the man who had organized the very first search parties on that cold March night, never learned the truth either. They never saw him pay for it, Joanne said quietly. They went to their grave not knowing, and that was hard. The most complicated reaction of all came from someone no one expected to hear from, Kathy, John Hoff's own daughter. When detectives first approached her, Kathy had already been quietly researching the Candy Rogers case on her own. Something about it had stayed with her, a nagging feeling she could never quite name. She agreed to provide a DNA sample without hesitation. She never imagined what the results would reveal. Learning that her father was responsible for the murder of a 9-year-old girl shattered every memory she thought she had of him. Kathy had grown up believing her father's 1,970 suicide was the result of depression, a troubled man who could not find peace. The truth reframed everything. "Now I think he was evil," she said. "It wasn't an escape he got to die with people thinking he was an upstanding man, and he wasn't." Despite her own devastation, Kathy did something remarkable. She issued a public apology directly to Candy's family. "I'm very, very sorry for what my dad did. He took her life horribly. I hope that it gives some peace knowing that even though it's not really justice because he doesn't get any punishment, his name has this on it now, and they can know it's solved." It was an apology no one had asked for, and perhaps because of that, it meant everything. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Candy Rogers case is that many of the clues investigators needed had been sitting right in front of them for decades. Long before DNA technology existed, detectives had collected extensive evidence from the crime scene, interviewed countless witnesses, and pursued every promising lead. They worked tirelessly with the tools available at the time. Yet the pieces never quite came together. Looking back now, the connections are chilling. Just 2 years after Candy's murder, in 1961, John Ray Hoff was arrested for attacking a woman. Court records show he used force to remove her clothing, tied her up with the fabric, and attempted to strangle her, a method strikingly similar to what happened to Candy. Investigators would later discover that Hoff had lived only about a mile from Candy's home. He was familiar with the neighborhood and may have even known her through family connections to the Camp Fire Girls program. All the pieces were there, but without modern forensic science, they could not be linked. And that may be the most frightening part of this entire story. For more than 50 years, John Hoff was never publicly named as a suspect. He was never arrested, never questioned, and never forced to answer for what happened on that afternoon in March 1959. In 1970, at just 31 years old, Hoff took his own life. With his death, the truth very nearly died with him. Had the original evidence from Candy's clothing not been carefully preserved, this case might never have been solved. Had advances in DNA technology come even a few years later, John Hoff's name may never have surfaced. In many ways, he almost got away with it. Not because the investigators gave up, not because the clues didn't exist, but simply because the science needed to connect those clues would not arrive for another half a century. For decades, the killer had been hiding in plain sight, and by the time the truth finally emerged, he had already been dead for more than 50 years. For more than 60 years, Candy Rogers' murder remained one of the oldest and most haunting unsolved cases in the state of Washington. Generations of detectives chased leads, interviewed suspects, and revisited old evidence, refusing to let the case be forgotten. Yet as the decades passed, many began to wonder if the truth would ever be known. By the time the mystery was finally solved, Candy's parents were gone. Her mother, Elaine, died without ever learning who had taken her daughter's life. Her father carried the weight of that loss for years before taking his own life. For the Rogers family, justice arrived far too late. And yet, the truth did arrive. What ultimately solved this case was not a confession, a witness, or a lucky break. It was the preservation of evidence and the determination of investigators who refused to give up. More than 6 decades after Candy disappeared, modern forensic science succeeded where every previous lead had failed. The revelation brought no arrest and no courtroom verdict. John Ray Hoff had been dead for more than 50 years when his name was finally linked to the crime. He would never stand trial for what he had done, but he could no longer remain hidden. For decades, Candy Rogers was remembered as the little girl whose killer was never found. Today, that is no longer true. Her story stands as proof that even the oldest cold cases can still speak, and that the passage of time does not erase the pursuit of justice. As we remember Candy, we also remember the countless investigators, family members, and supporters who refused to let her story disappear. What do you think? If DNA technology had existed in 1959, how different might this story have been? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay safe.